When you set up your machine, you want to be sure that your needle position is at the center, so your stitch width is at 2.5. Remember, this is the tension, and we don't adjust this. We leave this knob in this setting at all times. Your stitch length should be at about 3. Your stitch selector will be back to 2, which is our straight stitch. And you should test your machine, check the front and the back of the stitches to be sure that they are tight and even and everything is set correctly. So once your machine is set up correctly, we can start sewing. For this pattern and for all standard clothing patterns, we'll be using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. When your needle is in the middle position, there's sometimes a line marked 5/8, and in this case, you can see it's here. That means we want the edge of our fabric at that line the whole time we're sewing. We will, as always, backstitch at the beginning and the end. And we'll do the same thing with the other set of front and backs, still with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, backstitching at the beginning and the end. You notice when we come to the notch, we keep sewing straight. Ignore that. It's not part of your seam. It's just to help you match up your pieces. So we're going to go back to our directions, and we just finished sewing the fronts and backs together along the long straight edge. This is actually the side seam that would go down along the side of your leg. The next step here says pin each front to a back along the inner legs, matching at notch 2. That's this short section here. So what we'll do is take one of our sets of front and backs, and we can remove the pins if we haven't done that already. And without having to change how it's folded or arranged at all, what we're going to do is match up these two short seams. So I realize these don't line up on their own. You have to make them line up like this. And I realize that will make a gap here. This is actually the bottom of the leg. So first of all, it needs to stay open. We don't want to accidentally sew this closed. But also, just like I said before, the back of your body is slightly bigger than the front, which is why it's really okay that there is a gap. These don't line up perfectly. They're not supposed to. So we're now going to sew this seam with a 5/8 seam allowance, and we'll do the same with the other leg. I've removed my pins and I've trimmed some of the loose threads. So what I have now are two sets. Each has a front and a back. Each is sewn along the long outside edge and the short inside edge. The next step in our directions is to sew the seam at the crotch. And so step 9 says turn one leg section right side out. Doesn't matter which one, so we're going to take one of these and turn it right side out. Now again, I've used a fabric that does not have an obvious right side and wrong side, but you can tell that this is the right side because our seam looks nice the way we'd want it to look on the outside of the garment. We don't see the seam allowance that's hidden inside on the wrong side. So this piece is right side out. This piece is still wrong side out. We can still see the seam allowances. So next it tells us to insert the right side out leg inside the wrong side out leg. And I realize that this sounds confusing. They have given you a diagram here. It's sometimes hard to interpret pattern directions until you're more comfortable and familiar with how they explain things and what the next logical steps would be. So I'm going to show you how this would look, and then we'll be pinning the seam. As you can see, just this curved seam from here to here. And it also says to stitch again, which will reinforce the seam. This is what we call a stress area. The crotch of any garment tends to be the first place to wear out or pull or get a hole, so that's why we'll sew that area twice. I've got my right side out leg. I'm putting it inside my wrong side out leg. And you can see side seams on this side, inside short seams together on this side. And this here, this U-shaped part is what we're going to be dealing with. We don't want to sew this top edge together. This is our waist. And we don't want to sew these bottom edges together. Those are our leg holes. So we'll start here at the top edge. And we'll put a pin. I'm going to put another pin here at the inside of the crotch. I want to line up my seam allowances so they'll be in the same spot. And then up here, again, I'm going to line up the top edges. And so you can see this sort of U-shaped seam that we're going to sew here. This is the crotch from the center front down to between the two insides of the legs and back up the center back here. So I'm going to put a few more pins just to hold this securely, and then we're going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we want to be sure when we're sewing it that we're sewing just these two layers, not accidentally sewing any other part of the shorts into this seam. So we'll have to move it and turn it and adjust it as we sew. Again, we're going to use a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then I will sew again to reinforce the seam just slightly inside of where I did before. So what we have now is essentially a pair of shorts. We have the waistband, we have the two legs, crotch, side seams. What's left to do now are the steps for finishing. We will need to create a waistband casing to put the elastic in, which will make these quite a bit smaller and closer to the correct fit. And we'll need to also hem these legs so that we don't see the raw edges here. So I will make a separate video describing the finishing steps once you have gotten to this point.